What we're going to talk about, Mike?
Tyres, that's what we're going to talk about. And we're going to talk about aspects of tyres, things like tyre temperatures, pressures, compounds, solutions to problems, and then what to actually look for on the tyre, which is going to give you a clue as to which direction and which things to change. Tyres, I keep getting asked repeatedly about tyres, what to look for, what types of tyres, what is suitable and so on. So just quickly going over for people who don't particularly know or realise, you've got several different essential types of tyre to look at. This one here, for instance, is the original equipment tyre from my BMW 2020 machine. So it's effectively what's called a high performance road tyre, and it's as it were, a normal high performance road treaded tyre. It's not an intermediate. We'll get to intermediates in a moment. This one here is what I would describe as a race tyre. It's a moulded treaded tyre, which is essentially for classes which have to run treaded tyres, like your super sports, stock sports, things like that. The tread in the tyre is really for a regulation rather than anything else. You've got the compound of the tyre here, which is an SC2, because this is a Pirelli. So this is in effect a reasonably hard compound tyre. Now we'll come to compounds and that later on. But that, as you can see, is similar in the sense to the road tyre, but it's in fact a race tyre, not a road tyre. Next up is what a lot of people know is a slick. It's completely bald. The irony is it's still described, the top layer of rubber is still described as the tread, and the depth indicators are the wear mark indicators, which are these holes in the side, and that gives you an idea of how deep the tread is. It gives you an indication of wear rate as much as anything else. And the last one we're looking at here is a wet tyre. These are obviously designed solely for use in the rain only. They're very, very heavily cut. They're a moulded tyre, so they're a treaded tyre, but they're very, very treaded. And the idea behind this is to move volumes of water, large volumes of water, very quickly. And the compound of the tyre and the construction of the tyre is quite different than the slick. The compound, for instance, is extremely soft. When these warm up and their working temperature is quite low, i.e. they're suitable for, as it were, cold, damp, horrible days, that's kind of exactly what they're designed for. So you have your road tyre, your treaded tyre, you have your race treaded tyre, you have your slick, and you have your wet weather tyre. There's also a tyre which doesn't get a lot of coverage nowadays, which older people will remember as what's called an intermediate. Now an intermediate is people think that the race treaded tyre is an intermediate, and it's really not, in the sense that it doesn't. A true intermediate tyre was designed essentially for light rain, when the track was effectively just damp, so there was no real water to move, but there was a damp contact patch. And the idea there was the tread was to help generate movement in the rubber to keep the rubber warm. But essentially the compound of the tyre was very, very soft. So the true intermediate tyre has a very narrow window of operation. Damp for a limited period. If that damp disappears and it starts to go dry, very quickly the intermediate tyre will get out of its working range and basically they fall apart, and you might as well then be on a slick. So compound, construction, tyre working temperatures and so on, all of these things we're going to talk about. Right, most of the tyre manufacturers will run some sort of identification so you can identify exactly what the tyre is. For instance, this is a 255 ZR17, so it's obviously 17-inch diameter, which is bizarre because it's 17 inches, and then they go for all metric, which is 200 millimeters and it's not 55. The profile, the 200 is the width, the 55 is a profile, which means it's 55% of 200. God knows why they do that, but that's the way they work it out. So when you're looking at sizes, you need to know the width and the profile and the diameter of the tyre. Now also on most manufacturers there'll be some sort of marking on the tyre which will identify its year. And on Pirelli, let's find it, is here for instance. You've got 24th week, 2417 is year 17. So this was manufactured in the 24th week of 17. These other numbers here are basically serial numbers of the tyre, which will have a more accurate compound, but they tend to be sort of a little bit secret in the sense that not many people know what they mean. All the other markings on the tyre, you've got direction of rotation here, or direction of drive, because if a tyre is a rear tyre, it needs to know which, not just particularly rotation, but which is the way the tyre is being driven. And on the front tyres you'll see a direction of rotation, which there's a bit of a difference there. And then you've got simple things like which are more road orientated, where country of manufacture and maximum pressures and so on. And there's another small thing you sometimes see which can fade off with time. On the Pirellis they use two little orange or red dots. Now, as I said before, the two orange dots always line up with where your valve is. What's a handy thing to do as well is, if they aren't there, when you mount the tyre and you've got the tyre weighted up so it's balanced perfectly, is always try and put use the tyre white or something like that, some sort of a marker, so you can put a white mark on the tyre and say near a valve. That gives you an idea of location. Not so important on the front, but particularly on the rear. And what you sometimes get is under extreme acceleration, or say when the bike's jumping over the mountain and the bike lands and there's a big torque reaction through the suspension and so on. Sometimes what happens is the tyre will shift on the rim. The rim turns, the tyre's gripping the floor and the rim turns, and effectively the tyre goes out of balance. I've got angle valves. The standard ones kind of point up in towards the hub, and particularly if you try and, let's say you've just come in and the tyre's hot, and particularly the brakes are absolutely scalding hot, and you're trying to do your tyre pressures. If you're trying to get your hand up here to undo your valve cap or put a pressure gauge on, you end up with burnt hands. So I've always found it's a great idea is to put these angle valves on, so basically you can get at the cap easy and get at the pressure, because doing your pressures regularly when you're at a meeting or a track day is really important. Let's discuss four main factors when it comes to tyres: compound, construction, temperature and pressures. But before we look at these, let's talk about sizes and profiles first. Well, the most common sort of size ranges we're looking at on your superbike type tyres are essentially 180s, 190s, 200s. Now within them you get the profile changes, which is your 180/55, your 180/60, and we'll come to them in a second. Your 190s, the majority of 190s were made in 55 profile, and then we jump up to the 200s where you've got your 55 and your 60 profile, and we'll talk about that, the actual differences in a short while. The 180/55, sometimes the motorcycle manufacturers will specify a particular tyre that they want made because of a particular problem that they're having. For instance, the 180/55, the Pirelli Corsa, was made essentially for the Ducati 848s. And that sort of variant of bike which had a single-sided swinging arm, because a problem with the Ducatis in that respect is because of the where the swinging arm actually is and how close it is to the wheel, and how the eccentric cam, which adjusts the wheelbase essentially, you had a big problem with the tyre actually rubbing on the swinging arm. So they made a 180/55, so it was effectively a low profile tyre, so that gave you the biggest chance possible, or the biggest gap possible between the tyre and the swinging arm, so that you had adjustability. It was kind of model specific.
Okay then, so can you put in layman's terms please the difference between something like a 190/55 and a 200/55 please? Tell me about profiles.
Profiles, the best way to describe it or to show it is on this chart here. Well, I suppose the difference, if you talk about it in reality, between a 200mm wide 55 profile and 190 55, the actual height of the tyre, the profile of the tyre, is only 5.5mm. It's not a great deal anyway in reality. It's sort of less than the difference between a 55 and a 60 profile of the same width. Well, basing out the tyre being, let's say, a 255, 200mm is the width of the actual from edge of tread to edge of tread. 6 inches is basing it upon getting your sidewalls in the right sort of shape, so the tyre is inflated is the right shape ultimately. And then the 55 is a percentage of the 200, which works out on a 200 on a 6-inch rim around about 110mm. Now, if you change that to a 60 profile tyre, same width, 200mm, the profile then, which is from the top of the bead to the top of the tyre, is 120mm. So essentially you've lifted the top of the tyre 10mm. You're not changing hardly anything else at all, but you're changing the height of the tyre. Now that has two impacts essentially at the end of the day. If you increase the height of the tyre, essentially what you're trying to do there is create a larger footprint, because where the tread ends at your maximum lean sort of thing, at that point to the centre of the tread where you increase that distance, the 55 and the 60 is slightly longer because it's slightly taller to the top of the tyre. So the contact patch, wherever it is, you actually increase the contact patch, thus the potential or the theory is you get more grip. One of the biggest changes you'll actually notice that extra profile of the tyre is you make the tyre ever so slightly more round, so you're taking it off the sort of a flatter profile, it goes slightly more pointed. But one of the biggest things is you're increasing the rolling radius, because if you imagine looking at the tyre at the side now, a 55 circumference and the 60 circumference is a different length. The 60 circumference is slightly longer because it's slightly taller, and that's going to affect your overall gearing. Now it can be as much as a tooth on your rear sprocket, for argument's sake. It can make a significant difference, and it also lifts the bike ever so slightly. So the potential there is you're actually starting to put a little more weight on the front wheel. It's small. I would struggle to find a difference, honestly. The difference is small. Having said that, in British Superbike, when they made the jump on the new size of tyres, nearly all the teams started to struggle with the original settings of the bike. They started to struggle with getting a base setting to make the bikes handle and work. But because they're right at the absolute limit of grip and limit of technology, the small differences start to become a big difference. For the majority of riders, us common people, the differences are barely noticeable, to be honest.
So this 10mm difference between a 255 and a 260?
No, if you were running the swing, your tyre or your wheel, if you were trying to reduce your wheelbase and you were running the tyre or the wheel, should I say, quite forward in the adjusters, you may have a problem with the difference between 55 and 60 with tyre clearance, not between the edges of the tyre, because that technically hasn't changed. You start to run a little bit of a difference between the leading edge of the tyre and the swinging arm. And there's another side shoot to it. A lot of 200mm tyres aren't actually 200mm. A lot of 190s aren't 190s. There's a little bit of flexibility that when it comes down to manufacturing and what the motorcycle manufacturers want. Kind of everybody wants a 200 because it looks sexy, because it's nice and fat. If you were to measure the average 200 tyre, it's probably closer to 190 than it is to 200. You're looking at 192, 194, around that sort of size. Unless the motorcycle manufacturer specify they want exactly 200mm, and the tyre manufacturers then will produce a tyre which is exactly 200mm. So there's the thing for you, is rush out to your bike now, and if you've got a vernier gauge wide enough to go around it, is measure the width of your tyre, measure your 200mm tyre, and the chances are you'll find it will be fractionally less than 200 millimeters. Okay, let's look at construction. This is something you don't actually see every day. What I did is to try and help describe profiles and things is cross-section the tyre. So this shows quite accurately now a definite visual representation of what I'm talking about when it comes to profile. Now, tyre manufacturers design the tyres to fit specific rim widths to suit the width of the tyre, etc. Now, there's a certain tolerance, which they will say in their description, which allows them to sort of go on to slightly wider or slightly narrower rims. But you do see quite a lot of people, they'll fit tyres, oversized tyres to their bikes, which can sometimes dramatically affect the shape of the tyre. So this is obviously this part of the tyre here from the bead, which is these edges here, which fit into the rim. So from there to there, that is effectively the sidewall, and the tread of the tyre runs right the way around over to the other sidewall and then back to the bead. So this tyre is a 200 section, so it's designed ultimately to fit something like a 6.25, something like that, but certainly about a 6-inch rim. Now you do get people from time to time fit them on 5.5-inch rim, and they can tolerate that to a point. But if you start to get it dramatically smaller, effectively what it does is if I squeeze the side of this tyre in like it's going on a narrow rim, you can see how it starts to change the profile of the tyre quite dramatically. Now at the contact patch, which is up here on the road, obviously it doesn't affect it that much. Where it does start to affect it is essentially it's starting to get towards the sidewall, and what tends to happen then is you don't exactly fall off the edge of the tyre, but the profile, if you squeeze them in enough on a very narrow rim, effectively what happens is you get to the point of the tyre where, imagine the ground actually starts to do that, so the profile of the tyre changes so much that you fall off the edge of the profile, not off the edge of the tyre. So what happens there effectively is the contact patch gets reduced and reduced and reduced, and when you start to fall off the edge of the profile, effectively the bike will start to slew around because the side grip goes almost completely. So it's extremely important that you run the right profile and size of tyre on the right size of rim. Don't just think big is better, it often isn't. Now over the years what they've tended to do is reduce the profile of the tyre to effectively increase the amount of tread which goes onto the floor, the footprint of the tyre. When the tyre hits the floor, it sort of flattens out to create a footprint. So that's the footprint which people talk about, and as you lean the bike over around the corner, that kind of flat footprint goes to the edge of the tread itself, and that flattening out of the tyre is called deflection, and that's what creates most of the heat inside a tyre, how the tyre generates its heat. But the problem with that is the sidewall of the tyre actually is part of the suspension. When you go over bumps and you'll see a tyre when it's flat on the floor, you'll see some deflection, and that's effectively what's happening in the sidewall. And if you reduce the sidewall too much and increase that, decrease the profile of the tyre, you're actually decreasing the suspension of the tyre. So it can be counterproductive. So this is a typical profile of tyre. Now it also shows the actual construction of the tyre. So as you can see, this part of the tyre here in the rubber lower sidewall is actually the bead. This fits it into the rim itself, and the steel runs right the way around, and that gives the tyre rigidity. Further around in the structure of the tyre, you can see its little brown section here, that's rust, because within these tyres are bands of steel, thin wire steel running around. And you'll also get, depends on manufacturer, and that they run sometimes carbon, sometimes Kevlar, all sorts of materials in the tyre, in the construction of the tyre, to give the carcass, which isn't the tread, it's the actual thing that the tread actually sits on, because the tread is essentially from just above my fingernail there to the top. So that's the tread of the tyre, whether it's a slick or a treaded tyre or a wet, that's the tread. And the carcass of the tyre is effectively the steel and the Kevlar and all the rest of it, which goes inside to make up the carcass of the tyre. Now this tyre's been heavily worn. You can tell by the edge of the tyre here how the tread depth is just about gone at its edge here. This is a typical wear pattern when the back tyre does get kind of worn out. What you tend to find is the very edge of the tyre, which doesn't get as much use as the sort of about 1.5 to 2 inches in. This is the heaviest worn part of the tyre, and you can actually see then how the thickness of the rubber here, which is fairly typical of almost new, and as it gets round to the worn part, it runs right the way down, so it's probably only about 3 maybe 4 millimeters thick when it gets to the bottom of the tread. Now if this was a slick, that would be effectively a wear hole, so as soon as the wear hole disappears, that's the sort of rubber depth that you've got down to. Let's look at some manufacturers' charts to discuss compounds. This is the operating range and compound chart issued by Bridgestone. It gives a flavour of what a lot of the manufacturers will produce is effectively a chart or a range that you can utilise to give you a more accurate tyre selection. Now, this is a fairly simplified version of what ultimately you need to be thinking about. It's displayed on what's called an XY chart here. On this side of the chart, you've got track temperature from low going to high. And then you've got also track severity, which essentially is how much grip the track offers. If a track is quite smooth and hasn't got an abrasive surface, you're down this end of the scale. But as it gets more aggressive, the track, not particularly bumps, but the actual abrasiveness of the track, the more abrasive it is, the further up this end of the scale that you go. And the same on this chart here. And it shows here the VO2 front. The soft tyre covers quite a large range to choose from. It covers from cold up to medium temperature, and it also is better suited for a smoother surface. But if you're running it at, say, a track, for argument's sake, like Thruxton or something which is quite aggressive, the surface, you're probably better off, even when it's cool, running a medium. You have to kind of balance, compromise the difference. So there's obviously a selection to choose from, and there's a bigger selection, generally speaking, when it comes to rear tyres. Once again, you've got your track temperature from low going to high, and then you've got smooth to severe. And now the range of rear tyres is obviously, you've got 4 to choose from. You've got an extra soft here, which covers obviously cool temperatures and so on. And then you can run it through soft into a medium soft, and then into a medium itself. Now, the one thing that you have to also remember about this is the softer tyre will generally give you more feel. It allows you to run in a colder temperature, and ultimately will give you more grip, but you pay the price for that in the performance of the tyre will probably not last as long. So the harder the tyre you run towards a medium, or if some manufacturers offer a hard compound, they give generally more stability in the tyre, but you need a warmer temperature. But you won't have quite as much grip as the softer tyre option. But the benefit is you'll get, generally speaking, more life out of the tyre. So from an endurance perspective, you want to be running slightly harder tyres. And if you want short races and ultimately more grip, go for softer tyres. But you have to take into consideration all the aspects, which is the abrasiveness of the circuit and the track temperature. And track temperature also includes air temperature as well, but they kind of run fairly synchronized. If it's hot outside, generally the surface of the track will be warm. It's worthwhile having a laser temperature sensor so that you can gauge more accurately what the tyre temperature, the air temperature and track temperature. You can kind of come up with a chart yourself. This is a guide as much as anything else. Some different tyre manufacturers have a different idea of a hard compound for cold or hot, soft for cold or hot. So whichever brand that you're using, make sure that you use the correct tyre chart. Don't use a Dunlop tyre chart for Pirelli tyres or vice versa. Stick to the manufacturer's guide and stick to the manufacturer's pressures, temperatures and so on. I use the Bridgestone tyre chart as a reference point to show, because it's fairly simplistic and it gets the idea across. and the Bridgestone technical staff verified the information which I've talked about. So generally speaking, that's why I use that chart. If you have a look at that, it's a beautiful wear pattern. Now this is a slick, obviously, and the little ripples you see here are, this is what I would describe as a perfectly worn tyre. That's the wear rate and what the tyre should look like during use. You don't want to see banding on the tyre, which is like a aggressive wear in usually about 1.5 inches in. You want to steer clear of that. Or as that starts to come up, it will progressively get worse. So what you need to do is change something or do something, otherwise eventually it will destroy the tyre. But that tyre has completely gone now. The wear holes have disappeared, so it's completely worn out, yet it's still gripping very well, and the wear rate's beautiful. All tyres will have a working range. That means it's a range in which whether it's a temperature or a condition that the tyre is designed for and works best in. Great example is in sort of light rain or damp, when the track isn't really wet enough for wets, but a slick isn't any good either. They use what is basically a treaded race tyre to try and make that work as an intermediate, and ultimately it doesn't work because a treaded race tyre is out of its working range if the temperature isn't right. And generally speaking, if it's raining, the temperature has come down, so trying to keep that tyre in its working range temperature wise is particularly difficult, where an intermediate tyre is designed to work in those lower temperatures. So the big mistake people make there is thinking a treaded tyre is an intermediate, and it really isn't. Most modern treaded race tyres are only treaded to get them into a regulation, which means they're sort of a road-based tyre, loosely road-based tyre, but in fact they're a race tyre with tread. Big difference. Again, it's that common mistake people make, is they're trying to make a particular tyre work in a range which it's not really ideally suited to. Bedding a new tyre in, I've been brought up and taught to believe that a new tyre, as long as it's warm, for instance, like it's come out of a tyre warmer and you're going out onto track, as long as it's hot and you go out, almost straight away you can go up to a really good pace. Ideally put a lap in on it, just to sort of get the edges of the tyres lightly scrubbed, but generally speaking, certainly by the time you start your second lap, on the assumption you've kept the heat in the tyre, the tyre's basically good to go. So bedding in traditionally used to take some time because of the releasing agents that they used to put on the tyres to get them out of the moulds, but they've improved that dramatically now, so the bedding in is a relatively short period of time, and it's more important to keep the tyre warm. That's probably a bigger factor. Be prepared also for change in the weather, for instance. So that means say for instance if it's going to rain later in the day, make sure you've got either an intermediate or you've got your wets ready to go on rims, good and ready. Likewise, if it's raining and drying up, make sure you've got your slicks or your treaded race tyres in warmers, because they'll need a good hour on the average UK day to get them and the rims up to temperature. So don't wait till, it's after lunch and it's dry, bloody hell, I've got to get my tyres in, and the tyres aren't warm. And that's the mistake people make, is just try to be proactive, think ahead about what you're going to need, so that when it comes time, it's basically the only time that you lose is the wheel swap itself, as opposed to the wheel swap and then start panicking about trying to get heat into the tyres. Another really important thing is tyre pressures. Tyre pressures will vary, obviously, depending on the brand of tyre and also the condition that you're actually running the bike in. But what will also happen is, as the day goes on, you need to regularly keep an eye on the pressure of the tyre and the temperature of the tyre also. I use a laser temperature probe, so I can monitor the tyre temperature, I can monitor the air temperature and the ground temperature, so I can kind of get an idea of which way the temperature is in fact going. The pressure is a good way of doing that, and the idea, what I tend to try and do, is literally just before I roll down the pit lane, tyres still in the warmers, is do a pressure check there. That gives me like a datum line. I can then go out, do my thing. As soon as I return back into the pit or the garage, the very first thing I do is do a second tyre pressure check. You can then sort of see, has the tyre pressure gone up or has it gone down? Because you go out with the tyre pressure at a pressure that you want to run at, like a working pressure. But that's based on it being in a warmer. It may change, and it almost certainly will change when you go out. So the quicker you can get back to the paddock and measure that the temperature and the pressure, it gives you a good idea. Now, if the pressure has gone down, that means, generally speaking, the temperature outside, the track temperature, air temperature may be down. So you may need to put more pressure in the tyre before you go out, allowing that little drop in pressure to get to where you really want it to be. Conversely, if you come in and the tyre pressure's gone up above, let's say it's a hot day and it's gone above where you normally want it to be, you may need to ultimately set off out the pit lane with a slightly lower pressure, knowing that it's going to end up where you want it to be. So regular tyre pressure checks, absolutely vital. One of the important factors of maintenance with a tyre is also trying to keep the tyre down to as many heat cycles or the minimum amount of heat cycles as you can imagine. Now, base it on you having a brand new tyre. That tyre gets heated up in a tyre warmer, you go out on track and it stays at working temperature. As soon as you come back in, what is ideal, if you're at a track day for instance, is as soon as it comes back in, get it back in warmers so you keep it in its heat cycle. And what that is as the tyre temperature comes from its ambient temperature up to its working temperature, if you allow it to go cool, let's say you don't put your tyre warmers on, you go and have your lunch, come back, then you put your tyre warmers back on and have to bring it back up, effectively the tyre is going through a heat cycle as hot cold, hot cold, hot cold, or hot cool. And that isn't good for tyres. Every time, you've got to try and imagine it, every time it goes through a cycle and comes down, when you next take it back out, it doesn't quite get the same amount of grip and so on as it did originally. Tyres will obviously, it's like a sliding scale. The more you use them, the more grip you lose, but you'll have a period of time where the tyre will hold really good grip for quite a long period of time. And then as it starts to get to its dying stages, as you get down to the bottom of the wear holes, if it's a slick, or the bottom of the grooves, if it's a tready tyre, the performance of the tyre will start to drop away at that point, regardless of what you're doing with the heat cycles. But it's really important to try and keep the tyre heat cycles down to as minimum as you can. Now, when it comes to part worn tyres, I have no objection at all about running part ones. I've used them for years and years and years, not a problem. But a big thing about part worn tyres is you really need to know some of the history of the tyre. You don't know how it's been stored, and we'll come to that in a minute. But you also don't know how many heat cycles it is. What you see is the tyre which is in pretty good nick, but that could have been put through several heat cycles and not been taken out onto track, for argument's sake. So it's ideal if you've got some history with the tyre as well. Obviously, date stamping is important as well. Don't run tyres which are sort of like plus 5 years old. I would suggest, regardless of the condition of them, I would sort of have at 5 years as a limiting factor, as to kind of let him go after that, really. I mean, don't get me wrong, I have run old stuff in the past, but what you're talking about, ideal. A modern tyre, brand new, out of the tyre warmer, 100% grip. Anything else after that is like a sliding scale dropping down, whether it's heat cycles or age to a point. Yeah, storage of tyres is also really important. People just kind of leave them in the backyard and sort of wash them off, stick them on the rim, and off you go. Tyres ideally need to be stored in a cool, not cold environment, and ideally out of direct sunlight, because essentially the rubber itself, if you heat it up too much, it goes through almost like a curing process. So if you let's say if you've got it in a hot greenhouse or a shed or something like that, which gets boiling hot in summer and then below freezing in winter, the two opposites, that isn't good for the tyre. So if you're storing tyres, be careful there. Now, if it's been extremely cold, tyres, modern tyres, particularly the materials they're made of, the compounds and so on, they don't like to be handled too much or used too much, bashed about, thrown around if they're very, very cold. I remember a story a few years ago of a brand of tyre I can't mention the name of, and they were being delivered and they were being dropped out of the truck kind of thrown and rolled along the floor. And every time the tyre hit the floor, you could hear like a cracking sound apparently. And it was the tyre itself, because the tyre had come from France, and the tyres were very cold in the back of the wagon. It actually damaged the tyre because of the I think it's silicate. I'm not exactly sure of the material, but it damaged the tyre. So storage is really important, keeping it at a constant temperature, not too cold, not too hot. So storage, really important. Now, tyre wear is something you really do need to keep an eye on. Generally speaking, let's talk about you've got either a very good condition tyre or you've got a new tyre, and you've been out, and the wear across the tyre should be fairly even. What you should ideally get is little tiny like ripples running effectively right the way across the width of the tread itself, all nice and even. And what often you'll see in a tyre is you'll get what's called banding, which is usually it's about 1.5 inches in from the absolute edge of the tread. You'll start to get aggressive wear marks. They start off as thin kind of lines, and they get kind of more and more ripped, and it looks like the surface is being ripped away slightly. Now, as that starts to happen, what you ideally need to do is do something then. If you carry on, the tyre will just get worse and worse and worse, and eventually it'll get to a point where no matter, even if you cure the problem, the tyre won't recover. You can lightly damage your tyre, put some light scoring in there, sort the problem out, whatever it is, and then the tyre will recover and you can continue running it to the end. But if you let that banding get too bad, it simply won't recover, and effectively you can destroy a tyre very quickly if things aren't right. So review there, what's the things to look for are temperature. That's temperature of the tyre itself, its running temperature, and its temperature in the tyre warmer. Make sure the tyre is as close to you want it to be before it goes out on track. A good way of doing that is when it's in a tyre warmer, always check your rims. That's a good indication that the tyre's warm right the way through. If you have a tyre warmer on for only a short period of time, you touch the tyre or even temperature probe it, and it will be close to being right, but that might only just be the surface itself. If the tyre hasn't been kind of baked long enough, essentially you haven't warmed the rubber right the way through, and you can quite quickly damage a tyre by essentially the top layer gets kind of pulled off, and it's a common thing called cold tear. It's a similar sort of thing. So tyre temperature is really important. Pressures, and again, super important as well. So keep your eye on your pressures. Try and write stuff down, so you've got a log of a previous history of the tyre, of the bike, of the circuit, of the conditions, and you can actually start to predict or be proactive about what's going to happen and what's happening, and it give you clues as to things you did in the past which helped the tyre and what you didn't do which hindered the problem.
Hey Mike, I've heard that some people even do the tyre pressures on cold tyres. What do you think to that?
Cold pressure checking is a bit of a weird one, because you're basing it really on ambient temperature. Now, if you go to Jerez in the summer, it can be 40 degrees ambient temperature, so your cold tyre pressure starts off at 40 degrees. If you're at Cadwell Park in February, it can be -2 degrees. So from -2 to 40 degrees, there's going to be a massive increase to even get the tyre into its working temperature range. So I'm not a big fan of cold pressure tyre pressures as a base, because it's very variable where you're going to end up, what pressure you're going to end up with. So hot tyre pressures is a more accurate way of giving you a baseline of where to start from. It'll be much closer to the working range of the tyre. Even the best tyre warmers around struggle to get the tyres, the race tyres, up to their working temperatures like they are when you come in off the track. What is really interesting to do is when you do come in, whether it's cold or not, I always put my hand on the tyres, glove off, hand on the tyres, and that gives you an idea. Let's say if it's a cool day, you can start to feel the left hand side of it's cool, the right hand side of it's hot, and that's generally most circuits. The right side will be warmer than the other, but either way it gives you an indication of whether it's working. Now, talking about temperatures briefly, wet weather tyres, there's always this argument about whether you run tyre warmers on wets. I do, but I don't. My tyre warmers haven't got the temperature control. They're set at sort of 80 degrees, and that's not good for a wet. It will kill a wet. So what I would suggest is, and the reason I run tyre warmers on the wets is even a wet tyre will have a working range and it isn't stone cold. And it's not so much the tread which is important, it's the carcass of the tyre, because the carcass is super important as well as the tread. So the idea of running tyre warmers is try and get the whole tyre as a whole up to its working temperature. So the wets, what I tend to do with standard tyre warmers is give them 10 or 15 minutes and then leave them wrapped up but turn them off. And then after maybe another 10 or 15 minutes, give it another squirt for 10 or 15 minutes, just to sort of try and get heat waves sort of sinking into the tyre. So then you can go out and almost straight away you've got a tyre which is very close to its working range. It's never going to get hot, or hopefully it won't, because if it does get hot, the tyre, the chances are that the conditions are starting to dry up. So whether the making the jump from which tyre suits which condition can be slightly problematic. The simplest way I've always put this down to is if you can see spray coming off the tyres, generally speaking, you're probably going to need definitely a treaded tyre and probably a wet. Because if there's enough water on the floor, the track temperature starts to fall away. So keeping a non-treaded tyre warm in those conditions is virtually impossible. So as soon as the spray stops, yet the track is still damp, potentially you can run your intermediate tyre, which is a tyre which is designed to work in cooler temperatures, but the contact patch is wet. A racing treaded tyre is not an intermediate. That you might as well have a slick on. The difference is quite close in that respect. So if it stopped raining but the track is still damp, I would suggest the perfect tyre is your intermediate at that point, and there'll be a handover still of people hanging onto the wets. It's always an awkward place to be. You start to need to rely on dry lines, and that because obviously the racing line will start to dry up and stay on the dry line if you've got your slick or your treaded race tyre. If you've got wets and it's starting to dry up, you might want to run off the racing line slightly to try and keep the tyre as cool as you can, because that will be a cooler part with the damp and the water hitting the tyre, etc. But this is where your charts start to come in, and your records of monitoring temperatures and monitoring compounds. Generally, if it's cold, and it varies on manufacturer to manufacturer, you'll need to have a compound which is suitable for that temperature. A lot of the manufacturers run softer tyres when it's cool or cold, and harder compounds when it's hot. Some do it the other way around. So this is where again your charts and your tyre fitment chart and recommendation from manufacturer becomes a real major part of your riding. All of this video really is largely based on my own personal kind of experience, 8 years of riding, racing, crashing and enjoying biking. But all the compound charts and the size fitment charts and so on, they're all available online. So that's what I'd suggest to do, is get that sort of thing already downloaded so you've got the information in hand. Okay, just to recap finally, run the correct size of tyre for your bike and rim, run it at the right pressure and run the right compound to suit the right condition and the right tyre ultimately for the right condition. When I was cutting this tyre up out of interest, I thought it'd be pretty easy just with a hacksaw to cut through it. Wasn't right. So after about 5 minutes of hacking away, I thought, I know, angle grinder. Bloody hard work with angle grinder. To do what you see here took me about 15 minutes of hard work and sweat and smoke off the disc wheel. So it wasn't great of a